You've been told that showing weakness is a liability, but that lie is exactly what's keeping you stagnant. While you're busy polishing a facade of effortless mastery, you're suffocating the very resilience you need to move forward. Most of us are living in a perfection prison, an exhausting architectural marvel of our own making, where every brick is a curated success and every mortar joint is a hidden failure. We spend more energy maintaining the image of being a finished product than we do actually evolving. If any of that sounds familiar, stick around because today we're exploring the story of Lucas, a man who built the perfect reputation and nearly lost himself inside it. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. New ones drop every week. Lucas sat in the center of his workshop, his silhouette swallowed by the heavy industrial shadows of a life built on almost. To the world, he was the master who never missed. In reality, he was a man paralyzed by his own reputation. He stared at the glowing spark between his hands, a raw, flickering friction that was the only honest thing left in the room. The pressure to be flawless had turned his craft into a cage. He knew that until he was willing to let the world see the sparks, the failures, the unpolished grit, he would never truly be free. The air in the workshop was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy metallic silence of a life being lived in secret. Lucas moved through the gloom, a ghost in his own sanctuary, where the only light came from a single, high-placed window that felt more like a prison vent than a source of hope. Every shelf was a graveyard of almosts, prototypes that were 90% brilliant but 10% flawed, and therefore, in Lucas's mind, 100% invisible. To the outside world, he was the master who delivered only perfection, but this room was the shadow workshop, the hidden archive of the friction he was too terrified to show. He ran a calloused hand over a seam he had welded a dozen times, searching for a microscopic imperfection that only he would ever see. This was the tax of the effortless facade. For every hour he spent creating, he spent 3 hours hiding the evidence of his struggle. His reputation for being a natural had become a lead weight around his neck. He couldn't ask for help because masters don't have questions. He couldn't share his progress because geniuses don't have rough drafts. Lucas was trapped in performance poverty, possessing immense talent, but unable to spend it because he feared the currency of his effort was tainted by the mess of the process. He looked at the heavy tools and the cold, unyielding metal, realizing that his workshop wasn't a place of creation anymore. It was a vault where he stored the shame of being human. The success he had built was a hollow shell, and the darkness of the room was finally beginning to match the isolation in his chest. The crisis arrived not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow, agonizing realization that his perfect plan was a terminal diagnosis. Lucas stood over the central workbench, his breath hitching in the cold air as he attempted the final, intricate weld on a project he had promised would be his masterpiece. For months, he had fueled the myth of his effortless genius, but today, the materials refused to lie for him. The metal warped under the heat of his anxiety, a jagged, ugly scar blooming across the surface where a seamless transition should have been. It was the breaking point of the facade. As he looked at the ruin before him, the internal architecture of his ego finally buckled. The master was a fraud. The natural was an amateur who had simply run out of ways to hide his mistakes. The single spark he had been nurturing, the one honest thing left in the room, flickered and died, plunging the workshop into a darkness that felt absolute. He realized then that he wasn't just failing a project, he was failing the character he had spent 20 years playing. He sat in the silence, the weight of the shadow room pressing against his chest until it felt like his heart might stop. The perfectionism that had once been his armor had become his shroud. He was a man sitting in a graveyard of his own expectations, realizing that the high-margin life he had dreamed of was impossible to build on a foundation of secrets. In the total absence of light, Lucas finally stopped fighting to be the man the world expected and started to feel the terrifying, raw pulse of the man he actually was. The mask hadn't just cracked, it had disintegrated, leaving him naked in the dark. In the absolute hollow of the dark, Lucas felt a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades, the freedom of having nothing left to protect. The facade hadn't just cracked, it had disintegrated, leaving him sitting among the wreckage of his own expectations. He reached out into the gloom, his fingers finding the cold, scarred metal of his failed masterpiece. In the past, he would have hidden this ruin in the deepest corner of the workshop, a secret shame to be buried. But as he touched the jagged weld, he realized that the friction, the messy, unpolished reality of the struggle, was the only thing in the room that felt alive. He struck a match, the tiny flame illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion etched into his face. This was the raw spark, the moment where the need to be real finally outweighed the need to be perfect. With a hand that still trembled, he didn't reach for a grinder to smooth the mistake. He reached for his camera. He recorded the warp in the metal, the burn marks on his gloves, and the hollow look in his eyes. He spoke to the lens, not as a master delivering a sermon, but as a man admitting he was lost. "This is what it actually looks like," he whispered, his voice steadying as the truth left his lips. "It's not effortless, it's a fight." Taking that first step of radical honesty felt like stepping off a cliff, but as he hit upload, the suffocating weight of the perfection prison began to lift. He wasn't inviting the world to see a finished monument. He was inviting them into the forge. For the first time, the light in the workshop didn't come from a flickering bulb, but from the heat of a truth that could no longer be contained. The digital void didn't answer with the mockery Lucas had feared. It answered with a profound, resonant hum of recognition. As the hours passed, the notification pings on his silenced phone weren't demands for perfection, but confessions from others trapped in their own private workshops. By showing the scorched metal and his own tired eyes, he had inadvertently tapped into the magnetism of truth. He watched as the high-status clients who demanded impossible, sterile results quietly unfollowed, repelled by a reality they couldn't control. But in their place came a new breed of collaborator, visionaries who weren't looking for a polished lie, but for the grit of a real solution. Lucas stood at his bench, the light from the small window finally reaching the center of the room. He realized that his vulnerability was acting as a filter, a high-frequency signal that only the authentic could hear. He received an inquiry from a global design firm, not asking for his portfolio, but referencing the video where he had admitted his failure. "We don't need another person who knows how to hide mistakes," the message read. "We need the man who knows how to survive them." The friction he had once viewed as a leak in his armor was now his greatest competitive advantage. He was no longer competing on talent alone, a commodity the world had in spades, but on transparency, a resource so rare it was priceless. Lucas picked up a hammer, and this time the strike felt different. He wasn't trying to impress an invisible judge. He was simply working in the light. The right opportunities were flowing toward him precisely because he had stopped pretending to be anything other than a man in a forge, turning his struggle into the very substance of his power. The transformation was complete not when the world accepted Lucas, but when Lucas finally accepted the man in the mirror. He stood in his workshop, now flooded with the uncompromising clarity of the midday sun, looking at the piece that had once been his greatest failure. It was no longer hidden. It was the centerpiece of his collection, its warped seam polished until it glowed like a deliberate vein of gold. He had become an unbreakable master, a title earned not through the absence of flaws, but through the courage to integrate them into his identity. His career had shifted from a desperate sprint to a steady, powerful stride. The high-margin contracts that now filled his desk weren't predicated on a promise of perfection, but on a guarantee of resilience. Clients didn't just want his hands, they wanted his perspective, the hard-won wisdom of a man who knew how to turn a catastrophic crack into a structural feature. By killing the natural myth, he had birthed something far more durable, a legacy of transparency. As he picked up his tools to begin a new commission, the heavy, suffocating weight of the perfection prison was a distant memory. The shadows had retreated to the corners, leaving a space where the friction of the work was no longer a secret shame, but a celebrated spark. Lucas realized that the only way forward had been through the very struggle he had tried so hard to bury. He was no longer a performer acting out a role of success. He was a craftsman living the truth, proving to the world, and to himself, that your greatest strength is found exactly where you are most willing to be seen.